Let me ask you something. When you were 10 years old, what were you trusted to do? Not what were you allowed to watch, not what toy you wanted. Trusted. Trusted with a tool. Trusted with a chore that mattered. Trusted to walk somewhere alone. Trusted to help when something broke. There was a time in America when a 10-year-old was not treated like a helpless passenger in the house. A 10-year-old had work, real work, the kind that made the stove warm, the animals fed, the food stretch, and the household together one more day. Were the old days perfect? No. Some children were pushed too hard. But here's the part modern life does not like to hear. Many kids back then could do things at 10 years old that grown adults today would struggle to do for one afternoon. So let's start with something simple. Simple, at least, until the power goes out. A lot of old American kids learned fire early, not because it was cute, because heat mattered. A wood stove did not care if you were sleepy. A cold morning did not wait for an adult to get ready. A child learned kindling, draft, ash, smoke, flame, and most important of all, respect. Fire was not a toy, but it was not some mysterious monster either. It was a tool. It could warm the room, cook breakfast, dry wet clothes, keep a family from shivering through the morning. But if you acted like a fool, it could take the whole house. That is why old families taught children carefully. A 10-year-old might not be left alone with every part of it, but he knew dry wood from damp wood. He knew smoke meant trouble. He knew sparks had to be watched. And he knew heat did not come from a wall switch. It came from work. Today, plenty of grown adults can adjust a thermostat, but could not safely build a small fire in a stove if the power went out. That is not stupidity. That is lost training. Modern life made heat invisible. Push the button, pay the bill, let the system handle it. Old kids saw the chain. Wood had to be split. Kindling had to be dry. Ash had to be cleaned. The fire had to be watched. And the room stayed warm because somebody knew what they were doing. That kind of knowledge changes a child. It makes him careful. It makes him useful. And once a child knows he can help keep the house warm, he does not feel like decoration. Now, fire was only the beginning, because old kids did not just learn how to stay warm, they learned how to eat. A 10-year-old in an old American kitchen often knew more than people think. Not fancy cooking, not restaurant cooking, real cooking. The kind that takes leftover beans, a little flour, bacon grease, one potato too soft for selling, and turns it into supper. That was not entertainment. That was survival, wearing an apron. During hard years, especially around the Great Depression, families learned to stretch food until stretching became an art. Children watched. Then they helped. A girl might learn biscuits because her mother needed another pair of hands. A boy might learn eggs in a cast iron pan because hunger did not care about gender. Old kitchens were not always gentle classrooms. Sometimes the lesson was just stand there, watch, don't waste it. And children did. They learned that cooking was judgment. Is the pan too hot? Is the dough too wet? Can this still be eaten? Will one more potato make it feed everybody? That was math, memory, survival. Today, a grown adult can have a phone full of recipes and still panic if one ingredient is missing. That is the difference. Our grandparents did not cook because everything was available. They cooked because everything was not available, and that made them flexible. Convenience did not make us smarter. In some ways, it made us better at following instructions. and worse at thinking with our hands. A child who could help feed a family walked differently. Not proud, useful. There is dignity in that, and modern life stole some of that dignity when it convinced people that food should arrive finished. Old families knew better. Food did not arrive. Somebody made it, and often a child was standing right there, learning without realizing his life was being shaped. Now, number 4 is where some people get nervous, because this one involves sharp edges. There was a time when a child holding a hammer did not make the whole room tense. A tool was part of the house. A hammer had a job. A saw had a job. A pocket knife had a job. And if a child used one like an idiot, somebody corrected him fast. By 10 years old, many kids could pound a nail, tighten a screw, sharpen a pencil with a knife, fix a loose board, or help patch something that needed one more season of life. That was not special. That was participation. Because houses used to ask more from the people living in them. A screen door sagged, a chair leg loosened, a fence board split, and before anybody bought something new, the house asked one question: can it be fixed? Children heard that question over and over, so they learned to see broken things differently, not as trash, as a problem. That is a powerful way to raise a mind. Today, many adults live surrounded by things they cannot open, cannot repair, and are not expected to understand. When something breaks, the first instinct is not, "What happened?" It is, "How much is a new one?" Old kids were trained in the opposite direction. They learned the world was made of parts. Parts could be seen, adjusted, saved. That matters. Because a person who never learns tools becomes dependent on people who did. And let's be honest, modern life profits from that. A useful child becomes a capable adult. A helpless child becomes a customer. Now, I am not saying hand a 10-year-old a saw and walk away. That is foolish. But there is a difference between teaching respect and teaching fear. Our grandparents were often taught respect. A lot of modern people were taught avoidance, and those are not the same thing. Number 3 moves outside, and if you grew up around animals, you already know where this is going. A lot of old kids learned responsibility from animals, not from a poster, not from a lecture, from a living thing that needed them. Feed the chickens before school. Carry water to the dog before it freezes. Check the rabbit hutch. Help with the cow. Latch the gate right. Do it whether you feel like it or not. Animals do not care if a child is tired. They do not care if he wants another hour of sleep. They need food, water, shelter, attention. And if you forget, there is a consequence. That is how many grandparents learned dependability before they even knew the word. A 10-year-old who cares for an animal learns one thing fast: the world does not revolve around him. That lesson alone would shock a lot of modern life. Today, many adults like the idea of farm life until the farm needs them before sunrise. Old kids did not get to like or dislike it. They had to show up. And no, that was not always beautiful. There were cold mornings, sick animals, heavy buckets, tired children. But there was also competence. A child who can keep an animal alive learns timing, patience, attention, consequence. Those are adult qualities, and many of our grandparents learned them before most modern kids are allowed to walk to the store alone. Which brings us to number 2, because old childhood had distance in it, real distance. There was a time when a child could leave the house without a tracking app, without constant messages, and without an adult watching every step. They walked to school, to a neighbor's house, across fields, down roads they knew by memory, and when they were told to be home before dark, that meant something. Now I understand why parents are afraid today. Traffic changed, neighborhoods changed, news travels faster. Nobody wants to be careless with a child. But something was lost when children stopped moving through the world on their own. Old kids learned direction by walking. They learned weather by getting caught in it. They learned which dog to avoid, which creek rose after rain, which neighbor would help, which road turned to mud first. That kind of knowledge does not come from a screen. It comes from being there. At 10 years old, many grandparents had a map in their head because nobody handed them one. And that changed how they carried themselves. They knew distance, time, risk. They knew that if they made a bad choice, they still had to get home. That is the part modern people do not like: consequence. Old childhood had too much of it sometimes. Modern childhood may not have enough. A 10-year-old walking alone in 1955 was not always safe. But a grown adult today who cannot navigate 3 blocks without a phone is not exactly thriving either. So what did we gain and what did we lose? We gained protection, but we lost practice. We gained contact, but we lost confidence. A child who never has to find his way can become an adult who waits for directions. And our grandparents could not afford that. They had to learn the road. Now number 1 is the quietest one, but it may explain all the others. This may be the hardest one for modern people to understand. Old American kids were not entertained every minute. They were not handed a glowing screen every time silence showed up. They had boredom, real boredom, the kind that makes a child look around and notice the world. And out of that boredom came usefulness. A boy with nothing to watch might follow his grandfather to the shed. A girl with an empty afternoon might watch her mother roll dough. A child sitting on a porch might start whittling because there was wood, time, and an old man nearby who knew how. That is how skills entered a life. Not always through lessons, through proximity, through silence, through watching older hands work. Today, boredom almost never gets a chance. The second a child feels empty, something fills the space. A video, a game, a feed, a noise. And I think that has done more damage than people want to admit. Because boredom was not just empty time. Boredom was where patience lived. Observation lived. Imagination lived. Old kids had to sit with themselves. Some adults today cannot do that for 5 minutes. And that is why this belongs at number 1. Because a child who cannot be bored struggles to become useful. Usefulness requires patience. Patience requires quiet. Quiet requires a person who is not terrified of his own thoughts. Our grandparents had plenty of problems, but they knew quiet. They knew waiting. They knew not every minute needed to be filled. And in that empty space, they learned. They watched how a blade was sharpened, how dough changed, how an older man studied a broken thing before touching it. That was education. Not school education. Life education. A 10-year-old back then might not have known much about the world beyond his county, but he often knew how to be present when work was happening. And that may be why he learned so much. Because you cannot learn from old people if you are never really in the room with them. And today, too many children are in the room, but gone. So there they are. 6 things American kids once did at 10 years old that many adults today struggle to do. Start a fire safely. Cook from almost nothing. Handle basic tools. Care for animals. Walk alone and find the way back. And sit with boredom long enough to become useful. I'm not saying the old days were perfect. They were not. Some children were pushed too hard. Some carried weight that belonged to adults. But many of them also learned something modern life keeps forgetting. Comfort does not build capability. Practice does. A child does not become steady by being entertained every minute. A child becomes steady by being trusted with something real. A chore, a tool, a walk, an animal, a quiet afternoon beside someone who knows how to work. That is what shaped our grandparents. Not speeches, not motivational posters. Life. Life asked something from them early. And because it asked, they learned. So I want to know, what were you trusted to do at 10 years old? Did you cook? Carry wood? Feed animals? Walk to school alone? Help your grandfather fix something? Tell me in the comments, not just for nostalgia, for proof. Proof that usefulness used to be part of childhood. Proof that ordinary kids once learned responsibility before the world decided comfort mattered more than competence. And if that kind of memory still means something to you, stay with this channel, because there are old ways we should never bring back, and old ways we were fools to forget. Until the next video, remember this: a child does not need a perfect world to become strong. Sometimes he just needs someone to trust him with something that matters.